The story begins in silence. Not the gentle quiet of peace, but the suffocating kind that presses against your chest, heavy and unrelenting. The kind of silence that feels alive, as if it knows something dreadful is about to unfold. The plantation house flickered with faint candlelight. Shadows crawled across the wooden walls that had absorbed years of screams and suffering. Inside, laughter spilled from the master and his overseers, coarse and arrogant. Their voices rang against the ceiling beams, rising with the clink of glasses with the smell of roasted meat thick in the humid night air. To them, this was an evening of comfort, of indulgence. To everyone else, it was a fortress of cruelty. And there, moving silently among them, was Mary Thompson. Her steps were measured, her eyes steady. To the men, she was invisible, another enslaved woman made to serve their table. But within her, concealed where no one dared to look, she carried something more dreadful than any whip, more dangerous than any blade. She carried death itself, smuggled inside her own body. Imagine the weight of that secret. Imagine walking, speaking, breathing, knowing that every motion brought you closer to unleashing horror. What kind of desperation would drive a woman to such a choice? What cruelties had twisted her spirit into a weapon? These are the questions that haunt Mary's story, and they do not come with easy answers. The night crept forward. The men drank deeply, their faces flushed, their laughter echoing louder. The candlelight shimmered against their flushed skin, their eyes dull with wine and arrogance. Mary stood in silence, hands trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable calm of someone who has already crossed the point of no return. And then, a cough. A sudden harsh sound that sliced through the noise. A glass slipped from a hand, shattering on the wooden floor. Another man lurched forward, his body convulsing. Laughter twisted into confusion, then into screams. Chairs scraped violently as men stumbled, clawing at their throats, eyes wide with terror. The air filled with the metallic stench of vomit, with the thud of bodies collapsing. The overseers gasped, the master's voice cracked into silence, and the laughter that had filled the room dissolved into chaos. Through it all, Mary did not flinch. She stood rooted in the shadows, her breath even, her eyes fixed upon the ruin she had unleashed. Within minutes, the house that had once roared with cruelty fell into a stillness so absolute it seemed otherworldly. Death hung in the air like smoke, heavy, bitter, final. But how did Mary Thompson, a woman bound in chains of slavery, come to wield such horrifying power? What path of torment, silence, and determination led her to transform her body into an instrument of vengeance? To answer that, we must step back into the blistering sun of the cotton fields, into the cramped cabins that stank of sweat and sorrow, into the long nights where cruelty lingered like a curse. Because Mary Thompson was not born a weapon, she was forged into one, and that forging is where her story truly begins. The world Mary Thompson knew was not built for the living. It was carved out of torment, every corner of it groaning beneath cruelty. By day, the land stretched wide and bare, cotton fields shimmering like pale scars across the cracked soil. The air was always heavy, thick with heat that clung to the skin like chains. At night, the fields quieted, but the quiet was not peace. It was dread, broken by cries carried on the wind, the echoes of punishment that never truly ended. Mary was born into this. She did not step into bondage as a stranger. It was the only world she had ever known. Her earliest memories were not of comfort or warmth, but of aching hunger and the sting of discipline. By the time she was old enough to walk, her hands bore the coarse calluses of work, her back bent beneath burdens no child should carry. Yet even then, her silence concealed something fierce. The plantation itself was a structure of contradictions. To outsiders, it appeared as a place of prosperity, rows of white cotton swaying under the sun, the big house standing tall, polished wood and brick. But step closer, and the polish cracked. You would hear the creaking of warped floorboards, smell the stench of sweat soaked into timber, see the fields not as beauty but as graves where laughter was buried. The overseers ruled those fields like carrion crows, whips cracked not as tools of control but as instruments of ritual. striking flesh until screams blended with cicadas. They carried themselves with swagger, their cruelty sharpened not by necessity but by choice. Every lashing was a performance, a way to remind the enslaved that their lives were not their own. The master sat above it all, cloaked in the illusion of refinement, his cruelty masked with words of order and civility. But Mary saw through it. She knew the smile he wore at the table was the same mouth that ordered women stripped, men broken, children starved. For Mary, each day was survival measured in breaths. She woke before dawn, rising to the chill of damp soil under her feet, the air heavy with wood smoke and rot. The morning began with aching joints, hands raw from the day before, the bitter taste of hunger scratching at her throat. She bent over the fields while the overseer's shadow loomed, every crack of the whip carving fear into the silence. By evening her muscles burned, her skin stung with sweat that never cooled. The cabins brought no rest. They pressed tight with bodies, air so thick with heat and breath it choked the lungs. At night, whispers filled the darkness. Whispers of escape, whispers of punishment, whispers of dreams too dangerous to speak aloud. And through it all Mary endured. She endured the humiliation of being stripped of dignity, endured the nights when men with power took what was not theirs, endured the constant reminder that her life could be snatched away with a gesture. But endurance is not the same as submission. Behind her silence, behind the calm mask she wore, something else grew. Rage. A rage not born in a single blow but in thousands, layered until it was no longer anger at moments, but at existence itself. What does it take for a woman to hold that rage without breaking? What kind of strength hides behind lowered eyes and a bowed head? Mary gave nothing away. To the overseers she was another shadow. To the master she was another body. But in truth, she was a vessel filling with venom. Every insult, every bruise, every hungry night was a drop into that vessel. And like any vessel, it could only hold so much before spilling over. The soil of that plantation bore more than cotton. It bore silence, despair, and beneath it all, the seeds of something terrible. Mary did not yet know when she would strike, but she knew the day would come, because vengeance was not a question, it was a promise written in scars, and soon that promise would be kept. The seeds of vengeance are never sown in a single moment. They grow in silence, watered by pain, fed by humiliation, and tended by nights that stretch endlessly beneath an uncaring sky. For Mary Thompson, that seed had long been buried deep. But one night, something changed. A breaking point came, sharp and irreversible. Perhaps it was the sting of the whip biting into her back, the flesh opening under the overseer's laughter. Perhaps it was the violation of her body, stolen by men who believed her suffering meant nothing. Or perhaps it was the quiet mockery, the sneer of the master reminding her that her life, her dignity, her very breath belonged to him. No matter the spark, it lit a fire within her that could not be smothered. Mary did not scream when it happened. She did not cry. Her silence, long mistaken for submission, became her shield. Yet inside, her resolve hardened into iron. She began to listen more closely, to the whispers of other women in the cabins, to the old stories of herbs and roots that healed, and those that harmed. Remedies twisted into weapons, healing into venom. Knowledge passed not in books but in murmured fragments half hidden in shadows. At first it seemed like madness. How could one enslaved woman hope to strike at men who held her chains? But the idea returned, night after night, until it became something she could no longer push aside. She would turn her own body into a vessel of death. The method was grotesque, almost unthinkable. Poison, smuggled within herself, hidden beneath skin and blood, carried where no overseer's hand could search. The very thought made her shiver, but the shiver was not only of fear. It was of resolve. She had been violated before. This time, she would choose the violation. This time her suffering would bear fruit, not despair. In the stillness of night, she practiced with trembling hands, crushing herbs into a bitter paste, their sharp scent filling her lungs. She whispered, the names of roots in the darkness, each syllable weighted with both tradition and defiance. The mixture burned her tongue when she tested it, searing her mouth with bitterness. But bitterness was already her life. She swallowed the taste, like it was her birthright. Days passed. The plantation went on in its rhythm of cruelty. The crack of the whip, the wails of the punished, the endless toil beneath a blistering sun. No one noticed the shift in Mary's eyes, the way her silence deepened into something colder. She bent her back to the work as always. Her hands blistered, her body bruised. But inside, she carried a secret so foul and powerful it could undo the men who believed themselves untouchable. And yet fear was her constant companion. Each night, as she lay in the suffocating heat of the cabin, she wondered if the poison would claim her before she could wield it. Her heart pounded in her chest, not only from dread of discovery but from the knowledge that every breath she drew was borrowed from death itself. To carry death inside you. Have you ever imagined the weight of that? Still, amid the fear was an eerie calm, a strange clarity that comes only when a person has decided that their life is already forfeit. Mary no longer saw herself as a victim, chained to the soil. She saw herself as a vessel of retribution, walking deliberately toward her purpose. The overseers laughed in their usual arrogance, their boots thudding across the wooden planks, their whips coiled at their sides. They did not see the shift in her gaze. They did not hear the rhythm of her heartbeat when the moonlight fell across her face. They did not smell the bitter herbs clinging to her skin. But something had changed. By the time the sun set, the balance of power had already begun to tilt. The question was no longer whether Mary would strike, but how dreadful the blow would be, and how many would fall with it. The night of vengeance came draped in celebration. Candles burned low in iron sconces, their flames licking the smoke-stained walls of the great hall. The master had gathered his overseers for a feast, a display of triumph after a season of harvest wrung from broken backs. The long table groaned under platters of roasted meat, trenchers slick with fat, and goblets brimming with deep red wine. Their laughter clashed with the clinking of glasses, an ugly chorus of arrogance that filled the stale air. Mary entered, quietly as she always did, the sound of her bare feet swallowed by the creaking floorboards. No one noticed the stillness in her eyes, the unnatural calm in her breath. She carried herself as though she were part of the smoke drifting from the torches, unseen and unimportant. Yet inside her body was the weapon they could never imagine, a grotesque secret pressed into her flesh, carried with each measured step. The scent of roasted venison hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of wine and the musk of sweat-soaked uniforms. Mary's hands did not tremble as she set the platters down, her fingers brushing against cups, bread, and knives. She poured their wine, the crimson liquid glinting in the candlelight like spilled blood. They drank eagerly, not once glancing into her face. Why would they? To them she was nothing. To her they were already corpses. At first, the night unfolded as it always had. The overseers barked crude jokes, their voices loud and slurred with, "Drink." The master, seated at the head, spoke in pompous tones, boasting of control, of wealth, of the years ahead. His jeweled ring clinked against the glass as he lifted his goblet, toasting to dominion built on misery. Around him 10 overseers laughed, chewing with open mouths, their knives tearing through the flesh of animals with the same ease they tore through the flesh of men. But then, the shift began. A cough, sharp and sudden, cutting through the laughter. Another, this time deeper, wetter, the sound of lungs fighting to draw air. A goblet clattered against the wood, spilling wine across the table like a spreading wound. Chairs scraped violently as men shifted, their faces tightening, their throats constricting. The poison had begun its work. One overseer gripped his stomach, his knuckles whitening as he doubled over, a strangled groan ripping from his throat. Another clutched at his chest, his face draining of color, sweat pouring down his temples. The master blinked in confusion, his words slurring mid-sentence as his mouth foamed, white froth streaking his lips. Then chaos erupted. Screams pierced the chamber, raw and animal, as bodies convulsed against the floor. Plates shattered, meat spilled, Candles toppled in showers of wax. The air thickened with the stench of vomit, bile mingling with the iron tang of blood as men clawed at their own throats. Their boots thrashed against the boards, heels hammering a frantic rhythm as though they could kick death away. One man's eyes bulged grotesquely, veins rising like black rivers beneath his skin before he collapsed, his jaw locked in a frozen scream. The master staggered to his feet, clutching the edge of the table, his face slick with sweat. His eyes darted wildly, first to his wine, then to Mary. For the first time he truly looked at her. The realization dawned. Too late. Too dreadful. His lips parted to speak, but only a choking gurgle escaped. His knees buckled, and he fell face first into the feast he had presided over, his blood mingling with the grease of the animal he had mocked her with hours before. One by one the overseers followed. Their strength dissolved into spasms, their voices shattered into cries that turned to silence. 10 men, stripped of their power, lay sprawled across the floor like broken dolls, their whips and boots meaningless, in death. The hall, once filled with raucous laughter, now echoed only with the final gasps of the dying. And through it all, Mary did not scream. She did not weep, she did not run. She stood at the edge of the table, her eyes cold, her breath steady. The flickering candlelight painted her face in shadows, giving her the look of something otherworldly. Not woman, not slave, but a vessel of vengeance made flesh. The silence that followed was heavier than any chain she had ever borne. Have you ever imagined such silence? Not the silence of peace, but of judgment. The silence that lingers after ruin, when the world has shifted and nothing will ever return to what it was. By the time the last body stilled, Mary was the only figure upright in the room. The walls still smelled of smoke, meat, and wine, but beneath it all hung the acrid, undeniable stench of death. What began as their feast had ended as her reckoning. But the night was not finished, for silence is never eternal. The silence that followed was heavier than death. The great hall, once swollen with laughter and drunken boasting, now reeked of bile and blood. The bodies of the master and his overseers sprawled across the floor like discarded husks, their limbs twisted, their mouths frozen in grotesque contortions. Plates lay shattered, goblets overturned, their contents pooling into dark stains that bled into the wood. Mary stood alone at the center, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The faint crackle of a dying candle was the only sound to accompany her breath. Firelight cast her shadow long against the wall, distorting her form into something inhuman, something larger than flesh. She did not move to clean, nor to flee. She simply stood in the wreckage she had wrought, a still figure among chaos, as though the silence itself had chosen her as its keeper. Outside, the night remained unnervingly calm. The wind did not stir, the fields did not rustle. Yet in the cabins scattered across the plantation, whispers had already begun. Enslaved men and women had heard the faint cries, the sudden silence. Some swore they saw shadows flickering in the master's windows, unnatural and twitching like spirits at war. Word spread before dawn, growing sharper with every retelling. The master was dead, his overseers had fallen, and at the heart of it all was Mary. But what was she now? Some whispered she had turned witch, her vengeance born of a pact with demons, summoned beneath the cold moon. Others said she had drawn upon the restless spirits of those beaten, whipped, and buried in the soil of the fields. To many, she was no longer merely a woman, but something far more terrifying. Retribution made flesh. Fear took root quickly. Without the overseers, there was no lash at dawn, no barked commands breaking the morning air. But silence brought little comfort. It was not freedom that settled upon the cabins, but dread. For they all knew vengeance had its price, and the world beyond the plantation would come searching. When they found the bodies, they found Mary too. Some say she was standing still as if waiting, her eyes fixed on nothing. Others claim she had vanished into the night, leaving behind no trace but the stench of poison and the memory of her gaze. The truth is lost in the haze of terror, buried beneath the whispers that carried her story beyond those fields. What we do know is this: her act was a wound cut deep into the fabric of the South. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, fearful that rebellion had taken new and unimaginable form. Was this a lone act of vengeance, or the spark of something larger? Authorities searched for her, desperate to reclaim control, but in many accounts, she remained elusive, a shadow unclaimed by capture, a name whispered like a curse. Inside the ruined hall, the smell lingered longest. Blood and bile soaked into the floorboards, staining the wood in a way no scrubbing could erase. The slaves avoided the house, eyes averted, as though even looking at it might draw her spirit forth. The master's chair remained empty, the lash untouched. For once power had shifted, if only for a fleeting breath in history. Have you ever stood in silence so heavy it feels alive? The kind that presses into your skin, crawling beneath, it reminding you that something irreversible has taken place? That was the silence of Mary's aftermath, a silence haunted not just by death, but by the weight of what her vengeance meant. By the time the sun set on that day, the plantation no longer belonged to its master. It belonged to fear. But the quiet did not last. Mary Thompson's name did not fade with the bodies she left behind. It lingered, whispered in the cabins where chains still rattled, carried on the wind through fields where men once cracked their whips. For some, she was a monster, a woman who turned her body into a weapon, who smuggled poison within her very flesh and delivered death with her bare hands. For others, she became something closer to a saint of vengeance, a reminder that even in the cruelest bondage the enslaved could rise, if only for a moment, and turn terror back upon their masters. History, of course, tried to bury her. Women, like Mary, were not meant to be remembered, their stories too dangerous to record in full. The powerful preferred silence, and silence was a weapon sharper than any lash. Yet silence could not erase the memory of that night. It lived on in half-spoken tales, in warnings muttered to children, in legends shaped by both fear and awe. Mary became a dual figure, both victim and executioner, fragile and dreadful, human and ghost. She was remembered in contradiction, as all truly haunting figures are. To some, she proved that desperation could drive the enslaved to monstrous ends. To others, she proved that the human spirit, crushed but never broken, could still claw its way toward justice, no matter how dreadful the form. And so her legacy endures, not written in books or carved in monuments, but in the haunted air of the South itself. When the wind moves through broken fields carrying the smell of damp earth and smoke, some say you can almost hear it. The cough of a dying man, the gasp of a master brought to his knees, the silence that follows when arrogance meets its end. Have you ever stood in such silence, the kind that feels alive as though something long dead still lingers just beyond reach? That is where Mary Thompson lives, not in ink, not in stone, but in the shadow between fear and reverence. She is a reminder, a warning, a question that refuses to be silenced. By the time the night presses close and the fields lie still, her story returns like a shiver. Was she a monster? Was she a savior? Or was she something far more unsettling? The truth of what desperation can create in the heart of the oppressed. Mary Thompson lives in that silence, and forever a shadow, forever a warning.